So, welcome back. I'm introducing you to Chapter 1, an introduction to crime and criminal justice. And we're going to jump right in because this is CJ 100, Intro to Criminal Justice. And so let's get right into it because I want this first lecture to set the foundation on what the rest of the topics will cover for the semester and what they'll be. So let's jump right into this, shall we? So when we look at what is the criminal justice system, here are some of the most commonly words associated with the criminal justice system. We have law, we have jail, we have corrections, crime, misdemeanor, bail, bond, probation, parole, courts. Essentially, all of the words that you see on your screen, we will talk about in some variation or another. Again, I know this is a condensed course that we have, but what I want to underscore is that the criminal justice system, while it may be considered scary to some because they don't understand it, for others, this is a very unique system. It's a system that I have been a part of for a substantial period of time before transitioning into academia. And I'll explain more of that as we go into different chapters, especially when we can start getting into those primary components of the criminal justice system. Hang on, because we're going to talk about it in just a little bit. But as you see on your screen, whether you take the police or you take a lawyer or you take a felony, these are words that if you hear, even if you look at mainstream society, and right now there is a very infamous case going on, maybe we'll talk a little bit about it when we get to the courts chapter, so stay tuned. But there's a very infamous case going on right now in real time involving a certain mogul, and many people are following this because the question that everyone has on their mind, will he or will he not spend the rest of his life behind bars in prison? But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. We will talk about that later on. So let's keep moving, shall we? So the criminal justice system comprises institutions, policies, and practices with the goal of social control and deterring crime through sanctions and rehabilitation. Ultimately, crime is a key component of the criminal justice system. If you don't have crime, you don't have a criminal justice system. And as we look at focusing on those institutions and policies and practices, we have to address what happens if someone breaks the law and commits a crime. So there are three primary components of the criminal justice system. First is law enforcement. Secondly is the courts. And thirdly is corrections. The way this course is set up, even though it's a quick crash course that we're going to go over the next essentially 5 weeks. So buckle up, lock in, get focused, because we're taking 15, 16 weeks worth of material and condensing it into 5 weeks. It's a lot of work, but you have to stay focused. And the purpose of my lectures online is to present this in a manner as if you were sitting in one of my classrooms, whether it's in Farrah Hall or Lloyd Hall or in any other location. With that being said, we will talk about the three primary components of the criminal justice system, and they're broken down into modules. So you will see, when we talk about law enforcement, we have several chapters on law enforcement. When we talk about the courts, we have several chapters on the courts. And then, of course, we have several chapters on corrections. But please stay tuned and follow along, because this is the three primary components of the criminal justice system are what we will focus on over the course of this semester. So we know each component has their own distinct functions. Again, we're going to get into this in greater detail in the coming, modules, but I want to lay the foundation for you now because, again, I'm talking to people who generally don't understand or have very little knowledge of the criminal justice system. And if you have some knowledge of the criminal justice system, then you're in great shape because you're already going to know what I'm talking about. But for those of you who don't, I want to break it down in a very easy term. So when you walk away from this course, or if you're watching here, if you're anywhere out in the universe or in the world watching this, it will make sense to you. So again, what is law enforcement? What do? They They investigate crimes. They apprehend individuals. They take care of people who have committed crimes. And when we say take care of people, that means they lock them up. When you think of law enforcement, we think of police, we think of the sheriff's department, we think of other law enforcement agencies. We'll get to some of these over the course of the semester because there's a lot of law enforcement agencies out there beyond just your police and beyond your sheriff's office. And I can't wait to talk about law enforcement because that's where my background comes in. And we have the courts. The courts are responsible for interpreting and applying the law. They also sentence offenders. Now, key personnel when it comes to the courts include lawyers. Some people, somebody on here that's in this course or maybe out there in the world watching this may say, I want to be a lawyer. Well, you work in the courts. But there's other court personnel. Once again, we will cover that. So stay tuned when we get to that module and get to that section of the course. And then lastly, we have corrections. This is the one that I have probably the least experience about. However, I do love corrections. I love talking about corrections. This component of the criminal justice system involves incarceration in jails or prisons. It can include supervision in the community. That's called community corrections. And while I don't have experience in corrections per se in an institutional setting, I do have experience in the community setting. So what's very unique for those of you who just tuning in, never seen any of my other videos, don't know anything about my background, I essentially have worn a hat in all three components, even though I've never been in a jail or prison. But again, getting ahead of myself, we will talk about that soon. So let's keep moving along here. If we look at the size of the system, even though there's been reductions in violent and property crimes, the criminal justice system is huge and very costly. Now, the reason for this is because a large proportion of juveniles and adults are under the control of the criminal justice system. Data taken from around 2023 by the Bureau of Justice and Statistics said that about 5 million people were under supervision of the adult correctional system, with 2 million in jails or prison. So that means that means that the vast majority of people were under some adult correctional supervision. They probably were on probation, maybe on parole. Again, these are topics we'll cover lately, so you don't need to know it now. But 2 million are incarcerated in jails or prisons, and that's right here in the United States. Now, at the end of 2016, you have more than 6.6 million people who were supervised in jails, prisons, or in the community. So basically, what you see is you see a reduction from 6.6 million total people under supervision to 5 million total people who are under supervision in about 2023. So we are making some progress, which is good, but that's still a lot of people who are incarcerated, under or within the criminal justice system. The system is very costly, though. The most recent data, and data is not fluid, it's very difficult to pull data, but the most recent data, which is right around the pandemic, 2020, said that the system employed about 3 million people. State and local governments spend about $129 billion on police, $86 billion on corrections, and $51 billion on the courts. So as you can see, the criminal justice industry is a very lucrative business. What I like to tell students, even though I'm mostly talking to people who may have no desire to work in the criminal justice system, you could be taking this course because you just want to learn about the system. I mean, that's part of why I have this YouTube channel. I want to educate people in the field of crime and criminology and criminal justice, because nobody's really talking about this. But what I want to say is that it is a career that is always searching for people, and there are a lot of opportunities for individuals if they desire to make a change, make a difference, or get involved in public safety. And as you can see, police is the largest, bears the largest monetary expense when it comes to the system, followed by corrections. Again, we will get into this in greater detail in the coming weeks. So I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap on how the criminal justice system works. Again, all of this is a little bit quick. We will cover this in subsequent chapters. So as long as you are coming to this channel, or, obviously if you're in this class, you will follow along. But for everyone else, that if you are just coming to this channel and you're like, okay, just stay tuned for each chapter when it comes to Intro to Criminal Justice, because we will go over this roadmap in greater detail. But I just want you to see really quickly, obviously, the way the roadmap works is, first of all, if a person, commits a crime, and it becomes known to the police, then they're going to investigate it. They're going to try to identify the suspect. They're going to apprehend them. Then the person will go to court. Discretion is a key role. We'll cover discretion as well. Prosecutor may file charges. You might go to plea bargaining. You may go to trial. You may say, I don't want to go to trial. I'm willing to accept a plea, but I don't want to fight it. So you may say a nolle prosequi, which is Latin for to be unwilling to pursue. If charges go forward, then you go to arraignment. So again, where I'm going to show you just that there's a number of steps that will be undertaken within the criminal justice system. Now, again, sometimes a person may enter a plea. They can plead guilty, not guilty, or nolo contendere. Now, the nolle prosequi, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The nolle prosequi means that the prosecution is unwilling to pursue. It's called a nolle pros. Again, we'll get to that in greater detail. Now, in terms of a plea, though, an individual may say, I'm guilty, not guilty, or I'm just going to plead no contest because I just want to get it over with. I don't want to fight it. I don't want to dispute it. I'm not saying I did it, but I'm not saying I didn't do it. So I'm going to plead no contest. Once again, we'll get to this in greater detail. I'm just giving you the foundation so you know what to expect in the coming chapters. Of course, you have a trial. Then you have the conclusion of the trial. And then, of course, there is sentencing. And in sentencing, there could be any number of things that can happen. A punishment, going to jail, going to prison, getting probation, getting a fine, but all of those would be considered punishment, and that would be at the end or the conclusion of the sentencing. So when looking at the criminal justice system, it is important to at least acknowledge that there's a victim, because you will have someone that has had a crime committed against them, and if they have been the victim of a crime, or if crime has been committed against them, rather, they are what's called a victim. And generally speaking, the victim is missing from the classic roadmap of the criminal justice system. Now, there's a course that I have lectured on countless times called victimology. Matter of fact, I have at least like a couple of videos on the channel that you can go back and look at. Not many, but a couple. Now, with that being said, victimology is a discipline that is often overlooked because what it does is it examines the victim's role in a crime, but also the criminal justice system's response to helping the victim if they have been subjected to a crime or if they've been victimized. So that's what the discipline of victimology really examines and focuses on. But as you see, the victim is missing from the classic roadmap because oftentimes within the discipline and field of victimology, the victim is an afterthought. Most of the focus is on the offender or the perpetrator. And again, we won't talk about the victim so much in this course, in this context. That's a whole different class. But the victim does need services, whether it's emotional support, psychological support, medical care. They will need services to navigate through the criminal justice system. So before we talk about crime, we have to acknowledge that crime does affect everyone. You're taking this course or you're tuning in because maybe you have been impacted by a crime, or maybe you've never been impacted by a crime. And I pray that you never have or you never will be. But we do understand that crime is always occurring and it will impact all people. And it does generally impact the lives of everyone. Because even though you may not personally be a victim, depending on what happened in that particular crime or the set of circumstances around that crime, Maybe legislation will pass or legislation will be passed that could affect you. Maybe you might see increased patrol in your community or in your neighborhood or in your apartment or dorm or your a complex or wherever you live. So remember, crime does affect everyone. In fact, look right here. Judicial activism occurs when decisions are influenced by personal and political factors. When crimes are committed, sometimes politically, you see changes. But generally speaking, you might see greater changes if the crime that has been committed affects people that make decisions. In other words, sometimes personal feelings and motivations could influence and impact whether or not some of our rights are changed for safety purposes or not. But generally speaking, if the person has been committed by a crime or their family has been committed by a crime, they will let their personal ambitions affect decisions or make decisions that affect all of us. So just keep that in mind when I look right here and it says that crime affects the lives of everyone, because it really, truly does. So let's talk about what is a crime. And I want you to think about your definition of a crime. See, the common definition of a crime, especially within the criminal justice system, is defined as the breaking of a law. That's it. It's the breaking of the law or breaking of a law. And generally speaking, it's the breaking of a law that has been defined by a governing authority or some other authority that will have a punishment. See, you can't commit a crime or be accused of committing a crime if the actions that you committed have no punishment. Then it's not a crime. If you do something and break a law or commit an act that has a prescribed punishment, that's a crime. That's a crime. Understanding that there's some different types of crimes. You have street crimes, identified crimes portrayed in the media, have a victim and an offender. They may have weapons. It can be homicide. It could be assault. It could be battery. You also have property crimes. Property crimes are more common than street crimes. Think about motor vehicle theft. Think about burglary, property theft. Like, those are property crimes. Property crimes are a lot more prevalent than street crimes because street crimes, generally speaking, are a little bit more personable, right? Even though property crimes are personable because you don't want to have your phone stolen or like your watch or jewelry stolen. But generally speaking, property crimes are the most common crimes because we have stuff. We have a lot of stuff. Think about your home, your apartment, your dorm, wherever you live. You have valuables, you have possessions, you have stuff. Generally speaking, someone is more likely to steal that stuff from you than to attack you in a violent manner. So that's why property crimes are a lot more prevalent than street crimes. We also have victimless crimes. Once again, just like I explained that the victim is generally not talked about, that's why we have the discipline of victimology. Victimless crimes often get overlooked as well because think about what these victimless crimes are. Illegal behavior that usually doesn't affect another person. While they may be harmful to the person that's committing the act, like when we look at these examples, prostitution, drug use, gambling, but it does beg the question, is a victimless crime or are victimless crimes truly victimless? And I think we can argue that they're not, because if it affects one person, you have a victim. Even though it's a self-inflicted victim, you still have a victim. We have white-collar crimes. We won't really get into white-collar crimes in this course. That's for a different course, i.e. Criminal theories or criminology. But white-collar crimes are usually crimes committed by people in a corporate setting, government profession. White-collar crimes could be bribery, Ponzi schemes, price fixing, insider trading, pyramid schemes. When you hear a white-collar crime, you're thinking large quantities of money, and you're definitely thinking prison sentences because you're talking hundreds, if not thousands of people who may have been impacted by the actions of a select few, and their motivations were monetarily or money based. So that's where a white collar crime is, that's where white collar crimes are prevalent. We also have cybercrime and terrorism. Again, two topics that are primarily covered in a different course. Cybercrime, illegal activity using a computer, terrorism, the threatened use of coercion or violence against a population of people. We'll cover terrorism a little bit towards the end in a very brief chapter. But again, these are other types of crimes that people generally don't think about, or again, with this being an intro course, you may not have really truly sat back and said, oh yeah, cybercrime, stuff happening with computers, hacks, cyberbullying, child pornography, all of those things, viruses. That's a major crime that many people don't really think about, especially if you're not in the discipline of criminology or criminal justice. Now, crime definitions, generally speaking, are categorized in two categories, right? They're classified in two categories. The mala in se, behavior that is immoral and inherently wrong by nature, and the mala prohibita, behavior that's prohibited by law. So you get that word prohibita, it's prohibited by law. When we look at, for example, mala in se and mala prohibita. For example, marijuana. Now, I love this topic in class. I love it when I do this in a live class because it is one of the best debates. Anything related to substances, drugs, narcotics, etc., it's going to get people talking. And I love it. As a professor, I just absolutely love it. When we look at marijuana, we can see that it was definitely a mala prohibita behavior, because it was 100% prohibited by law all over the country. But then guess what? We had a lovely state, Colorado, was one of the first states to go ahead and say marijuana is going to be legalized for recreational use. And now you look right here. We have 24 states that have legalized marijuana for recreational usage. Now, Alabama is not one of those states. My state of Georgia is not one. There's a lot of other states that are not legal. When you get to a lot of the Bible Belt states, so to speak, it's not legal for those purposes as well. But what I do find fascinating, and this is one that is a bonus question, so take note. There are several countries, 5 notable countries where marijuana is legal. Now, there may be other places, but 5 notable countries where marijuana is legal for recreational use: Canada, Mexico, Germany, South Africa, and Thailand. Now, again, there may be other countries, but these 5 really stood out as some of the key countries that are allowing marijuana for recreational use. Again, Canada, Mexico, Germany, South Africa, and Thailand. So think about, if you are taking a trip to, a foreign country, insert any other foreign country, and you have some marijuana, you might be a little bit careful because you could be criminally charged. So just keep that in mind. So I do want to do something fun as I continue on with this lecture and try to get this all wrapped up. I want you to see that some states, and I've picked some of the states that I have been a part of or lived in or, have been to. And I want you to see that some states have very bizarre laws. I don't know if there's anyone in here or anyone that's watching this video that lives in Florida. But look at some of these insanely bizarre laws that hit in Florida. For example, you cannot live with a partner, intimate acquaintance, if you're not married. Uh-oh. So if you're living with your girlfriend and your boyfriend, technically you're breaking the law. You cannot park at an intersection. Hello, who wants to park at an intersection? You're probably going to get hit because cars can't turn. And look at this last one. You cannot sell your children. Of course, naturally, me living in Florida for the better part of my life, look at this. I was visiting Florida several years ago, went to a wonderful beach destination, and had to go to a parking garage to retrieve my vehicle. And I saw this and I took a picture of it because I thought it was freaking hilarious. We do not accept cash, Venmo, Cash App, Apple Pay, Bitcoin, XRP, small children, etc. Sorry for any inconvenience this may cause. Notice that they said we cannot accept small children. That tells me somebody in Florida tried to sell their child so they could go ahead and, pay for their parking. But it's only in Florida. Now, Georgia, they also have some very arcane head-scratching laws. Look at some of these laws. For example, it is illegal to keep a donkey in a bathtub. Last time I checked, donkeys should be kept outside so they have quite the area to graze in. On Sundays, you cannot carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket. I don't know why you'd want to do that because if you've been in Georgia, it gets very, very hot. So I'm not exactly sure why you'd want to carry that ice cream cone in your back pocket. In Georgia, it does get very hot and it probably melts. But look at this one. In Atlanta, and Atlanta is a major city in Georgia, but in Atlanta, one man may not give another man a piggyback ride. Now, the next time I'm over in Atlanta or you come to Atlanta, if you are in the area or you visit or whatnot, let's see if we see anybody giving another man a piggyback ride and what may happen if the police are called. And then lastly, not to be outdone by Florida and Georgia, but I wanted to go ahead and talk about Alabama. As you see, I picked bordering states. So Georgia, Florida, Alabama. I could have easily picked South Carolina if I wanted to add that to the mix too. But first of all, it is legal to impersonate a priest. Speaking of church, you cannot wear a fake mustache in church because it might cause laughter. So just imagine if someone comes in with that handlebar mustache. And I saw somebody with a handlebar mustache. It looked fantastic. But if you walk in with a fake mustache in church, you're probably going to get criminally charged. And in Mobile, Alabama, it is illegal to use confetti and silly strings are not allowed. So listen. When we look at crime, some states have some of the most arcane and bizarre laws. New York has them, and, Wyoming has them, and Ohio has them, and Tennessee has them, and, Michigan has them, and you can name any state that you may be from. They have bizarre, arcane laws, and I just wanted to show you what some of these ones are in the South, for those of you who are not in the South, because, hey, if you walk into a church with a fake mustache in Alabama and people start laughing, you better hope there's not a deputy or officer in there because you're probably going to get in some trouble. So when we look at some other crimes, just notice how definitions have changed over time. For example, a justifiable homicide, that's when the lawful and intentional taking of another's life. Law enforcement are acting within their official duties, people in the military. It can absolutely be very controversial. Again, we save this topic for other classes because I have taught a plethora of classes over the course of my academic career, and I talk about justifiable homicide a lot in other classes. Think about adultery. Having a sexual relationship between a person who is married and a person that is not their spouse, it's a very controversial topic, and it's certainly one that some jurisdictions may still charge people with adultery. Generally speaking, adultery was considered a sexual relationship conducted by a married woman and her non-married partner. So if the woman was married and engaged in a sexual relationship with a man that was not her spouse, she was in trouble, but you didn't have it the other way around. So again, laws have really changed over time. Driving under the influence, hopefully everyone knows what the legal limit is. If you don't know and you like to partake in alcohol, just be aware that the legal limit is .08. So anything at .08 or above, and a person could be subjected to a DUI or DWI. But it doesn't include just alcohol. It can include other substances and narcotics as well. So bear that in mind. When we look at this right here, sexual assault, it speaks for itself. Yes, there is a difference between sexual assault, sexual abuse, and taking a person against their will. But again, these definitions have changed over time, because in the past it was believed that a man could not commit that act against a woman, because they might argue, especially if the woman was married, they could argue, well, that woman is the man's property. But again, we won't cover that in this course. We save that for another course, but it is a topic that is definitely worth looking at and noting in future courses. Now, there is a debate that exists with understanding the purpose of the system. In fact, when we look at the purpose of the system, there are 5 perspectives that exist. We have the crime control, the rehabilitation, the due process, the restorative justice, and then the non-intervention. When we look at the crime control purpose and perspective, this is the most popular view, because with crime control, there's the belief in the notion that an offender needs to be punished, they should be harshly punished, and in doing so, it will prevent crime. It focuses on strict enforcement of the law. Generally speaking, you get those people that are like, yep, that person needs to go to jail, go to prison, needs to be locked away, and they need to get what's coming to them. The rehabilitation focus, on the other hand, says that, hey, this person should be rehabilitated. In fact, they should be treated. You have to treat them as sick. They need help because they committed a crime or they did something wrong. They can't care for themselves. So we have to treat people that can't care for themselves or help themselves. So that is rehabilitation and what that is. In fact, there's a nice system that focuses on rehabilitation we will get to in the coming lectures. The due process says that all people who are accused of crimes are treated fairly and equally. Now, once again, there is a very notable case that is going on in New York, and it's involving a mogul. And while there are no cameras in that courtroom, we are getting courtroom sketches and we are getting recaps daily. With that being said, despite the stuff that has come out in that case, and again, we will very briefly talk about it, but not too much, because this is a class and I want to keep this moving along. Recognize that that individual is given due process, and we will talk about how an individual is innocent until proven guilty. Every one of us receives the same due process. Now, restorative justice says that there's an appropriate role of the criminal justice system. That role is to repair the harm caused by criminal behavior. Essentially, it looks at bringing everyone together. A person should pay for their crimes, but also they have to recognize the harm that they cause. And in doing so, once they recognize that they caused the harm, if both parties can agree, restorative justice is a practice that can yield wonders, because the victim receives the forgiveness and the apology from the offender, and all parties come together to agree that the offender is going to make the victim whole. That is restorative justice. And then lastly, we have non-intervention. Non-intervention says that, hey, people should be, the system should be involved as minimally as possible. It's harmful because it stigmatizes the individual as an offender. I also like to call this the probation effect too. And essentially the probation effect basically argues that an individual who is on probation is stigmatized, right? So with that being said, if we're putting people under supervision, should we not address them or talk to them or see them in a more discreet fashion? Because once they are stigmatized as being on probation or being under supervision, their life is going to be very difficult, even though they're not in jail or prison, because people don't want to associate with individuals who are labeled as criminals. And that's why I call this the probation effect. So when looking at criminal justice, right, and public policy, as I start to kind of wind this up, there's two models. We have the consensus model. Everyone's going to work together to achieve justice, and there's an agreement about what behaviors are harmful. But then there's the conflict model, which is that struggle between the haves and have-nots. Think about the people who are in power, the people who have money, the people who have prestige and clout. They're the ones who determine what the system is. Generally speaking, people with power want the system to work in their favor. They want the breaks for their families. They want the system to work for them because they have the money and they have the power. That's the conflict model. We should operate in the consensus model, which is that, hey, the system works together for everyone. I don't care if you're a millionaire. I don't care if you make $100 a year. It works for everyone. And there is going to be conflict between the consensus model and the conflict model, which we will see a little bit of over the course of the next several weeks. So let's talk about crime in the media. It's really impossible to separate crime in the media. The major reason why is because people get their understanding and knowledge of the system from the media, and that media can be grossly misleading. Now, it's not my job as a professor to say this is fake news, this is misinformation, this is disinformation. These are terms that have become kind of common in our society over the last, 9-10 years, right? And people are quick to say that's fake news, that's fake news. And we never even had that term until about 9 or 10 years ago. With that being said, we do have to consider what are some of the media narratives as it comes to crime. And this is how we're going to wrap up this lecture. So a couple of different narratives. First of all, we have framing, and framing is broken into 5 categories. We have the faulty criminal justice frame, as well as the blocked opportunities frame, crime that are committed because the criminals feel they can get away with it. The system is faulty. So even though we have this system in place, people are still going to break the law because they think, hey, I can get away with it. That's why I'm going to do it. The blocked opportunities frame says that crime results from the lack of legal opportunities among offenders. This is really tied to criminal theories, and I talk about it in that class. Offenders who live in poverty, they're unemployed, they're discriminated against, they're going to see that crime is their only option. So that's blocked opportunities frame. Then we also have the social breakdown frame. Crime is an obvious result of a breakdown in the family or community. If families aren't strong, people are going to turn to crime because, well, who's keeping kids on the right track, right? The racist system frame says that the criminal justice system, law enforcement, the courts, and corrections are depicted as racist agents of oppression. Very controversial, but I will tell you there's this thing called disproportionate minority contact. Again, we're not going to talk about it in this class, but there is evidence to show that the system treats certain groups one way and other groups a different way. It's not right, but the evidence and the data is there. And then, of course, we have the violent media frame. Now, look, I have my own Xbox One controller, and I should have grabbed Mortal Kombat 1 or Mortal Kombat 11 because I don't have an Xbox One X or Xbox Series X. But either way, think about violent movies. Think about violent video games. Think about some musicians that might be speaking or talking about violence. I mean, heck, the other day I saw Final Destination Bloodlines, right? Very violent movie. If kids are seeing these movies, is it okay? If we were in class, we would have an argument or maybe a debate. Is it okay for a child that's maybe 10, 11, 12, 13 to see Final Destination Bloodlines or play, Grand Theft Auto 5 next year? I believe Grand Theft Auto 6 is coming out, or some other violent game, or listen to some violent music. Like, is that okay? We have to ask ourselves those questions, but that violent media frame says that because of the violent scene on TV and in games and in music and in movies, that's why people are committing crimes. And so some of the last things, we look at infotainment, thinking about how there's a marketing of a highly edited or distorted combination of entertainment. If you turn on the news, whether you see something on social media, TikTok, the news, whatever, we're only given one perspective, right? Anytime we look at criminal justice or we look at crime, we should have multiple perspectives. We might get the law enforcement or criminal justice side of it. We might get the victim side of it. We might get an innocent bystander side of it, but we need multiple perspectives. And sometimes when it comes to the media, we have this thing called infotainment because it's edited, and it's edited to prove a point. We don't get the full story, right? And that's problematic. With that being said, we get this thing called narrowcasting, and this is a narrow view of information in the media. In other words, certain media outlets are going to tailor their coverage to a specified audience. I'm not going to name any news outlets. I'm not going to get into the business of that. But you yourself can go look at certain news networks, national networks, that will tell a story one way while completely omitting the story a different way. And why do they do that? Because they want to engage and appeal to that particular audience. So when we look at the criminal justice versus criminology, the debate is going to rage where you will hear criminal justice. And what is criminal justice? It's the system. It's law enforcement. It's the police. It's the courts. It's lawyers and court personnel. It's corrections. It's jails and prisons. However, the opposite of that is criminology. That is the study of the nature, extent, and causes of criminal offending and criminal victimization. With criminology, we're looking at theories. With criminal justice, we're looking at the institutions, the actual system. So again, my job, hopefully by the end of this semester, or for anyone that's watching this and looks at videos and looks at them in sequential order, hopefully I will do the best possible job to explain the criminal justice system. I have a whole different class in lectures on criminology, which is the theory, and we'll talk about that in a different light. So, our chapter wrap-up as we come to a close. This is everything that we talked about when looking at an introduction to crime and the criminal justice system. The biggest takeaway on this, and I'm not going to go through this, but this is how I end all my lectures, is that please understand that there are three components of the criminal justice system. If there's anything that I want you to take away, is I want you to understand that there are three components of the criminal justice system. You have law enforcement, you have the courts, and you have corrections. If you can get that, then you have absolutely understood the basics of the criminal justice system. Now, what we will find as we continue on with other lectures is that the criminal justice system is very complex. And that is why after we get through these first few chapters, we're going to first dive into law enforcement. We're going to dive into the history of law enforcement, current law enforcement, discretion, and all that. Then we'll go to the courts, and then, of course, we'll wrap up with corrections. So I want to thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check out other videos that I have. And for this course, Introduction to Criminal Justice, we're going to go through all of these chapters. I'm going to do lectures and videos on all the chapters. And buckle up because we're in for a great ride. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And I'll see you next time.